a very, very warm welcome to this special event on emotional intelligence with Dan Goleman. And Dan, lovely to have you with us. Thank you for being here.
Mark, it's always a pleasure to join Action for Happiness and you.
Thank you. I think this is the fourth event we've done together. We're so grateful for all the time you've given over the years to, well, for everything you're doing, but also for supporting our mission as well. And it's a really exciting chance to be together because we're celebrating 25 years since your seminal book, Emotional Intelligence, was first published. So we'll obviously talk a lot more about that. But before we dive into our conversation, just to let you all know, listening at home, and I can already see 3,500 people live on this event and more still joining as I speak. So thank you for being here. Thank you for all the lovely greetings I'm seeing coming up on the chat from all around the world. Dan and I are going to have a conversation about emotional intelligence, the basics, but also the ways we can apply it in our lives and some of the implications for the world we're living in right now. And then you'll have a chance to put some questions to Dan as well. So please do use the Q&A function, and we'll try and get through at least some of the many questions I know you'll have. And we'll wrap up in about an hour's time. So really looking forward to seeing your comments. Please do use the chat to share your views, but also, again, if you'd rather just focus on Dan, please feel free to minimize the chat because I can see it's already very busy with lots of enthusiasm. So Dan, welcome. Emotional intelligence is the theme, and there's all kinds of ways I'd love to explore this topic. But before perhaps we even revisit what emotional intelligence is, I wondered if we could start back with emotions more generally. I've been feeling a whole range of emotions today, from worry to joy to enthusiasm, as every day. Why do we have emotions? What's the purpose of emotions, Dan?
Well, from a evolutionary point of view, if you really want to zoom out, emotions are the brain's way of making us pay attention to something. And so when you feel happy about something, you zoom in on that. When you feel angry about something, you pay full attention to that. And in fact, it turns out that emotional distractors, and this is from a modern life point of view, are more powerful than any other kind. Our emotions tell us what's matters right now, what's important. And so from a survival point of view, emotions, interestingly, the emotional centers have a 1 neuron long connection to the eyes and the ears, which means that they get information very fast, which in evolution must have been key to survival. Here comes something that eats me, I'm going to run. Or there's something I eat, I'm going to run after it, but you need to do that right away. And that's what emotions have done. Unfortunately, today in modern life, that design, which works so well in most of human prehistory, presumably, gets us in trouble. We can have what you might call emotional hijack. I've called it the amygdala hijack in my book, Emotional Intelligence, because it's the amygdala, which is a part of the emotional centers, which is the brain's radar for threat. That's what gets that 1 neuron long message. And it can hijack the rest of the brain, particularly the rational brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that comprehends, that makes good decisions. It can take it over in an instant if it thinks there's an emergency. And of course, the sign that we've had a hijack is not only do we have a strong emotion that's very sudden, but when the dust settles, we regret what we said or we did. That's the hallmark of the hijack. It just gets us in trouble. And it gets us in trouble these days with modern life because we're responding to symbolic realities, things like I'm not being treated fair, rather than biological realities, like it's going to eat me. But we have the same surge of biology as a result. So that's the short answer.
That's really helpful reminder of this really powerful signaling system that we have that sort of drives every aspect of our behavior. So Dan, I really enjoyed reading the new introduction you've written to the 25th anniversary edition of your book, and you very humbly in that sort of recognized that it wasn't you that created the concept of emotional intelligence, but your book did certainly put it on the map. And although I read it fairly soon afterwards, I wasn't paying as much attention at that time, but I know there was a real distinction between sort of intellectual intelligence and this emotional intelligence, IQ and EQ. I wondered if you could sort of remind us of what led to the birth of EQ or emotional intelligence, EI as you prefer to call it, and perhaps a bit more about what that means.
Well, I was responding when I wrote the book to an upsurge of interest in the IQ measure. The intelligence quotient. There had been a bestseller that pumped it up and said, if you're reading this book, you probably have a high IQ, and that sets you apart. And I went to some very competitive universities, and I saw, um, you know, from fellow students, the people who had very high IQ were not necessarily very successful. They sometimes had terrible personal relationships. And it got me interested in emotional intelligence, which means being intelligent about emotions. And I realized that the 4 parts of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, managing yourself, empathizing, tune into other people's feelings, and then putting that all together to have effective relationships, had a huge impact on how we do in life. And the book Emotional Intelligence is in large part an argument for teaching these skills to kids so that they get it right in the first place. They don't need, a psychotherapist to undo the patterns that they've learned. And also, I was surprised it's had a huge impact on business, because it's understood that leaders particularly need emotional intelligence. You need your technical skills to get the job. They're called threshold competencies, what gets you in the door. But once you're in the game, you're basically competing with people as smart as you are. And who's going to be the best team member, who handles themselves well, who can tune into other people, who can collaborate. Those are the things that mark you as outstanding. And that's why people become leaders. Leaders need to be able to manage people. They don't need technical skills so much anymore, because the people they're managing have them. So basically, I see IQ is important, but it's not all that matters. Emotional intelligence matters extraordinarily.
With that in mind, Dan, I'd love it if you could perhaps dive a little bit deeper into what you consider to be the foundations of emotional intelligence. You already mentioned, I think, the sort of self-regulation and the relationships with others. Can we go a little bit deeper into each of those?
Sure. And in fact, I think you'll find they're very congruent with what the activities of action and happiness. The first is self-awareness, knowing what you're feeling, why you feel it, how it's impacting what you do or what you say. And the application of self-awareness is mindfulness meditation, which is training in paying full attention to what's happening right now. Then there's using that information to manage yourself better, to get over being upset. Resilience technically is defined as how long it takes you to recover from the peak of your upset. I'm really angry, or I'm really scared, to getting back to that calm, balanced state that you were in before. And people who are highly resilient, who recover quickly, do much better than people who are poor at resilience, because if you're poor at it, it means you'll be thinking about that thing that upset you, a day later, 2 in the morning, you wake up. It doesn't do you any good to ruminate about that. So it's good to be able to drop it. Another part of self-management is being adaptable, being agile and changing, how you get to your goals, but keeping your eye on your goals, despite setbacks and obstacles, kind of bouncing back, and also staying positive, staying optimistic, no matter what happens. There's a saying in Tibet, if you can do something about what's upsetting you, why worry? If you can't do something about what's upsetting you, why worry? In other words, worry doesn't help you at all. And then the third part is tuning into other people, empathy, knowing what they're feeling. And people don't tell us in words. They tell us in tone of voice, facial expression, and so on. So picking that up and then using all of this, putting it together to have effective, positive relationships, to have a positive impact. I learned a lot from my wife about emotional intelligence. She's really got it. This morning, she changed an appointment with her dentist. And for me, I would have called and I would have say, yeah, I want an appointment in April. I don't want to go in December. Bingo. She spent a lot of time chatting with the person at the other end, getting to know her. They laughed a little about this and that. And in the midst of all that, she changed the appointment. But really, she was connecting with the other person. And, I see her as a teacher for me in emotional intelligence.
That's a lovely example, Dan. Thank you. I can already see some questions being raised on the chat. asking if this session is being recorded. So to all of you watching, yes, we are recording this session. Anyone who's signed up to join will have a chance to see this again. And we'll also be sending out via email some links to some associated resources and some helpful things that Dan would like to share with you all. So do just feel free to enjoy the conversation. Dan, one thing on my mind is, to what extent is emotional intelligence something we have inherently at birth? And to what extent is it a skill we can cultivate?
Well, this is interesting because it separates emotional intelligence from IQ. IQ basically is a measure of how rapidly we can learn something new, and it doesn't seem to budge much in life. However, emotional intelligence is almost entirely learned and learnable. And this is key because you may not be great at empathy now, but you can get better. You may not be great at managing your upsets, but you can get better. And we know this, we see it. For example, mindfulness, this is really important. Mindfulness turns out to strengthen the very circuitry that helps you recover from an emotional upset. And this is from brain scans done at the University of Wisconsin and other centers. It turns out that, the prefrontal cortex is the rational part of the brain, the thinking brain. It's the part of the brain that makes decisions. The right side of the prefrontal cortex is taken over by the amygdala when we have that hijack I was talking about. The left side can just say no. It inhibits the amygdala. And it turns out that the circuitry on the left side of the prefrontal cortex becomes more strongly connected the longer you've been a meditator. So mindfulness is very good for resilience. So I've gotten a bit off track, but back to you, Mark.
No, thank you. It's a really good point. I was just reflecting on, despite having practiced mindfulness for many years myself and having long been an avid student of the idea of emotional intelligence, even though I didn't really learn that at school, I do feel blessed that I came from a family environment that had a emotional intelligence to it. But even so, today we had some complicated situations at work. We had a sort of technology issue back at home that needed resolving, and I could feel sort of tension, worries rising, and was aware of them, had that mindfulness to be aware of them. But even so, just that managing the relationship between my amygdala and my sort of rationalization of that is a very complicated skill. So for those of us that have the benefit of maybe having some of the blessings I've had, or indeed gone much further than I have, that's maybe fine. But what about someone who hasn't had the chance to learn this at school? It's wonderful that you've encouraged such a focus on social and emotional learning in schools. It must surely continue. It's a vital building block. But if we are here in adult life and we want to cultivate more emotional intelligence, where do we start, Dan? What can we do?
Well, first of all, listen to feedback. I think it's good to hear from other people what it is we could use help with. Robert Burns said, "Oh, that the gods, the gift would give us, to see ourselves as others see us." It's a rare thing. You need someone you trust, someone you respect, someone who can be frank with you, to give you an honest look at where you could get better. And then it's possible to actually go through a systematic learning plan to get better. So for example, with empathy, one thing that helps is to get feedback from other people. You make your guess as to what people are feeling, but then if they tell you what they're feeling, well, then you know whether you're right or wrong. And that helps you with a learning curve. If you're going to deploy a method to recover more quickly from being upset, there are many such methods. You need to do it systematically. And by the way, for mindfulness to help you, it's important to do it daily, or as close to daily as you can, to get the brain effect that I was talking about. So in other words, there are ways in the social emotional learning programs you mentioned, they take the components of emotional intelligence, the 4 parts: self-awareness, self-management, empathy, social skill, and they teach these to children in an age-appropriate way. And they do it continually from even pre-K to the time they're going off to university. And so it helps the children's brain connect better, so they don't have to, do remedial work later in life, which we call either psychotherapy or action for happiness or whatever you can find. It's going to help you.
I love that advice to listen and sort of tune in to feedback about your behavior. And to some extent, implicit within that is a sense of sort of vulnerability, a willingness to acknowledge that you might need to do some work on yourself. And of course, the challenge I feel, or what's coming up for me, is what happens when we're in fight or flight mode. When we're feeling attacked, our sort of defenses go up. We're less likely to listen to feedback. We're more likely to have a strong sort of confrontational reaction. And I sort of wonder if many times as I look around us in modern society, we're seeing to some extent a societal fight or flight response in some of the polarization, some of the sort of fear of the other that we're seeing. Is it possible to help people lower this sort of fight or flight mechanism? Because in many ways, you can't begin to tap into your self-awareness and connections to others whilst you're in that heightened state.
Precisely. I'll share with the folks on this webinar. There's a method that I've been teaching to actually frontline medical people to help shift from that fight or flight response where you're not open to hearing anything. You get very defensive, very angry, whatever it might be, to a mode where you're calm again. Relaxation or parasympathetic nervous system mode, as we say technically. And it's very simple. It goes like this. You take a deep breath, you inhale so that your belly expands. You hold that breath as long as it's comfortable for you. And then you exhale very slowly. And then you take another deep breath into your belly. Hold it as long as it's comfortable. Exhale very slowly. And again, inhale deeply. Hold for as long as you can. Exhale, a long exhale. And you do this, say, 6 to 9 times, and research shows that this shifts the body from that fight or flight response to a very relaxed state. And it does it right on the spot.
I'm really benefiting from having just done that for some deep breaths, Dan. Thank you.
Yes.
I was intrigued by what you said about teaching this particular skill to frontline healthcare workers, because I think that's such an importantly timely topic. We know we have so much even more deep and heartfelt affection for people who are putting themselves at risk in the current crisis, and of course are dealing with life and death situations. Is it therefore possible to use that kind of skill in a real moment of tension, just to have that in your back pocket even when you're facing a really difficult situation? Is it able to act on us as quickly as it felt like it could on me then?
Well, I think when you're first doing it, it's good to be in private. But if you get good at it, you can do it on the spot. You can do it when you're talking to someone. So yes, it's a kind of good thing to have in your back pocket for those moments. And the healthcare workers are, I think, they're modern saints because they're putting themselves at risk to save other people's lives. And they have high anxiety about getting a virus themselves and also bringing it home to people they care about, their family, their friends. So it's a high anxiety time, understandably. And anxiety, as I said before, has its function, but if it's too high, then it can become immobilizing. So it's good to have methods that can help us recover quickly.
I feel moved to turn to the audience and the chat here for a moment, Dan. I always love people's interaction. And before we move on to sort of a bit more of the relational component, which I'd like to talk about next, just while we're thinking about dealing with our own personal emotional challenges to some extent, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience just maybe to share, if you'd like to, in the chat, just 1 or 2 words about how you're feeling right now, because there's such a mix of emotions. I'm sure many of us will be feeling grateful to be here with you, and perhaps slightly calmer after trying out that breathing exercise. But of course, many people are dealing with loss, uncertainty, worries, fears. So I'm just going to read out a few of the things that come up. Grateful and inquisitive, tired, relaxed, awesome, engaged, overwhelmed, curious, stressed, feeling pretty good, happy, calm, optimistic, hopeful, sleepy, mundane, anxious, angry, exhausted, isolated, enthusiastic, grateful, and so it continues, and many others coming past. Thank you so much for sharing those. Someone says, relaxed, Dan's voice was so calming. So that's nice to hear. But even in just that short excerpt of human experience, Dan, we can see the full sort of roller coaster experience of being alive, from anxiety through to hope, and much in between. So I'd love for us to continue in this conversation to help us find ways to deal with the difficult emotions and move forward. But a key aspect of emotional intelligence that you touched on at the beginning is about not just our dealing with our own emotions, but our interaction with others. What are some of the ways that we can deepen that sense of social and emotional intelligence, the way that we understand each other and relate to each other?
Yeah. Well, it turns out that one of the exercises like mindfulness that strengthens the part of the brain that cares about other people is a loving kindness meditation, or a circle of caring, which I believe is part of the repertoire in action, isn't it?
It is, yes. We
Yeah.
often encourage that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've done it with different groups in terms of what I call a circle of caring, where you think of someone you're grateful for. Gratitude is so important. And I know you work with gratitude and
Well,
action.
maybe we could try this now. Do you want to just talk us through the stages of those circles? And we could all try and visualize it while you're speaking.
Yeah. So just bring to mind a person or people in your lives that you're grateful for, who've been kind to you, who've helped you along, supported you at some point in your life. And with that person or people in mind, just to make the following wishes, may you be safe, happy, healthy. May you have a life of fulfillment. May you thrive. Just repeat those phrases silently to yourself, with those people as the target of that phrase. And now bring yourself to mind. Make the same wishes for yourself. May I be safe, happy, healthy. May I have a life that's fulfilled. May I thrive. Repeat those phrases for yourself. And now bring to mind people you love, people you deeply care about, and wish them the same. May you all be safe, happy, healthy, have a life of fulfillment. May you thrive. And then think of people you know, your neighbors, acquaintances, people at work, whoever it may be. Make these same wishes for them. May you be safe, healthy, happy. May you have a life of fulfillment. May you thrive. And now, in all directions, make those wishes for everyone, everywhere. May you all be safe, happy, healthy, have lives of fulfillment. May you thrive. And research, Mark, has shown that this exercise makes people more generous, more caring, more likely to help someone in need. Also makes people happier. The Dalai Lama says the first person to benefit from compassion is the one who feels it.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Very
the very
powerful.
wish is, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that exercise. I can feel both calmer and more connected to others as a result. And we've had a series of wonderful guests in these events to share skills around our relationships with each other. Dr. Roxy Manning recently helping us understand nonviolent communication, which feels to me really closely related to the idea of being emotionally and socially intelligent. But I guess as we look more widely around the world, Dan, there's lots of unhelpful trends in society. There are behaviors and attitudes and sort of in-group and out-group and polarization. And I don't want us to dive into political conversations, but I wonder if we could help everyone everywhere, to use your lovely last circle of concern, to develop more emotional intelligence.
Mm.
Do you think that would contribute to a happier, calmer and kinder world? It feels to me like it's the building block, or at least one of the building blocks that we're missing in modern society.
Yeah, I think there's a fast track and a slow track here. The slower track is social emotional learning, helping coming generations be less likely to contribute to the problems. The fast track, actually, this comes from a book I did with the Dalai Lama, Force for Good. He urges everyone to be a leader for the good, to take action for happiness and beyond. He says each of us has our own sphere of influence, our own set of talents, our own capabilities, our own levers, in whatever way we can leverage things. And if we use that for the good, and if we act now, even if we will not see the fruits of our actions in our lifetime, we can help as an aggregate create a force for good in the world. And I see that as working against, implicit racism, which is a huge problem. The environmental damage we all do in our daily lives, inadvertently, but still, and perhaps even for that gap between rich and poor has only been widening, which but seems almost criminal, as the Dalai Lama puts it. So what he's saying basically is think of yourself as having a sphere of influence. Might be your family, family and friends, might be work, might be politics if you're situated that way, but not necessarily. But whatever you can do it now. That's the key.
Dan, and it's so lovely to hear that. And we were so grateful in that book, the Force for Good book you wrote with His Holiness,
Mm.
that it mentioned the Action for Happiness movement. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of those individuals, I'm sure many of which are joining us on this event, who have taken a step to be a force for good in their local communities. They've been running our local community courses. We've had, since the lockdown, people running Zoom-based groups. So if you're not already involved in one near you, then please do check those out online, folks. And there were so many people that I get inspired by every day in our wider community that are such a force for good. And it reminds me of that wonderful other book you wrote called Focus, where you talked about focus on self, focus on sort of others, and then focus on social change more widely. So you've just articulated, a whole range of really big social issues, from systemic racism to inequality, climate, and so on. You mentioned when we spoke the other day about sort of the bystander effect, or how, to some extent, being just aware of these things isn't enough. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah. I was telling you about a friend of mine, Irv Staub, who as a child was saved from death by the Nazis in Hungary by Raoul Wallenberg, who made him a Swedish citizen, at least temporarily. He came to the States and became a social psychologist, and he studied the roots of evil. And what he found was an unnamed but really important factor is the silence of bystanders. If you hear someone make a racist remark, a joke, or act in some way which is a racist, if you say something, if you oppose it on the spot, it's very different than if you just stay silent, because the silence can be read as support, as agreeing with what's being said. So speaking up is very important, even in mundane everyday interactions, as a way to stop evil from growing. I find that a very powerful recommendation.
Well, on that note, before we come to questions, and I can see there's lots and lots of questions that have come up for you, Dan, as I would have fully expected. I wonder if we could do another sort of interactive moment with our lovely audience. We have 4.6 thousand people with us right now, which is lovely. On this idea of taking action,
Mm.
we've That's what Action for Happiness is all about. And I guess you've helped us think about what we can do around our own emotional regulation, how we can have a
Mm.
sort of more loving and compassionate relation to others, but also how we can be a force for good in the world. So maybe we could invite the audience to share something that they would like to take as an action. So folks, I guess that might be something about your own emotional state and dealing with the trauma and very real challenges you're facing. It might be something to do with rebuilding relationships, or it might be to do with something else you'd like to do. So Dan, I might, I know you may not be looking at the chat, so I might just read out some of these so you can hear them. I'd like to create a group near me, be less self-critical, start a daily meditation, be kinder to others, find ways to deal with my depression, listen more, listen to others, worry less, encourage empathy in government, teach social and emotional lessons, apply gratitude, speak up when I witness kindness, be more patient and compassionate, live in the moment, try not to lose my temper with loved ones, show humility, creating a group in Barcelona, connecting more with others, being more honest with myself, more about daily meditation, self-acceptance, and so they continue. So I
Beautiful.
feel that's a lovely example of everything you've been saying. How do you feel hearing that list?
Makes me feel very grateful to everyone who's going to take a step or is taking steps now. I think that Action for Happiness is a wonderful group because you don't say what action to take. You give a menu and beyond. You welcome everything. And I really feel a great sense of gratitude to everyone who's taking a step.
Thanks, Dan. So let's turn to some of these questions, and I may still sneak a few of my own in as well. But there's been quite a few people asking about the teaching of emotional intelligence in schools, and I'd just like to credit. I mean, your book and the foundations you laid has led to a very wide uptake of social and emotional programs. Although we'd all love to see it go much further, it's really quite remarkable how many schools and institutions have at least some aspects of this built in now. What do you think should be the priority as we look ahead in our education system? So, for example, Gareth was asking, what should we be teaching in schools? And he was contrasting the sort of curriculum that currently focuses primarily on the acquisition of knowledge, which is our, and our exam-based system. What would you say about the direction for education?
Well, I think knowledge is very important. I'm not against knowledge. Both my parents were academics, but I feel it's necessary but not sufficient, and that teaching the basics of emotional intelligence, social emotional learning, as it's called when it's translated into a curriculum, is essential. When I wrote Emotional Intelligence, I had just been one of a half dozen people who founded a group called the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which is the premier group worldwide that's been furthering the cause of social emotional learning. As you mentioned, it's remarkably successful, but there are many more schools where you could reach children who don't get that education now. But one of the things we've identified is the need to be sure teachers are helped along these lines because they're the model. They're the classroom, person of influence and power, and kids are looking to them. So if it's just a rote lesson in SEL, it's not enough. You need to be sure the teachers embody self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and so on, in order for children to learn it. And also that it's age appropriate. We also find it's important to bring families in. I wrote another book, Mark, you might want to put this in the show notes. It's called The Triple Focus in Education. It's about what we feel is the future. I did it with Peter Senge at MIT. And we say there are three levels, the three you mentioned: self-focus, self-management. And there we recommend adding mindfulness to the curriculum. Relationship management, collaboration, kindness. And we recommended a circle of caring type exercise because that seems to help in enhancing the ability to spontaneously care. And then the third was systems learning, understanding how systems operate, the economy, technology. We were all inadvertently culpable in climate warming. And it's because the things we buy and use have no marking for us to understand what their actual impact is on the environment. There may be some, and I applaud that, but there are 8 global systems that support life on the planet, and you may buy some chips that have the carbon impact mark, but you don't know about, how did they grow those potatoes? What kind of fertilizer did they use? Did the fertilizer, was it nitrogen based? Did it run off into a river and then the ocean? Did it kill life in a body of water? You don't know that. We can know it. There's a methodology for it. And if those impacts were marked at the point where we making a purchase decision, then you could look at one pack of chips or another and decide, well, I'll get the one that's least harmful, which would create a free market mechanism, a market force to pressure companies to improve their actual footprint. Right now, we don't know it. So that's the kind of thing I'd love to see the next generation insist on or help make real. So those are the 3, and it's called the triple force. Yeah.
Thank you. And I love what you said about the importance of the role of teachers in the education system as well, because not only do they need to embody it, but of course, many teachers are dealing with really difficult emotional situations. And these are skills that can really help them thrive in challenging times. So let's wind back from the sort of learning and social realm back to the individual. Magnus has asked a fascinating question. I find that when I'm angry, what I need to do in order to get back to normal is to cry and give myself a bit of a sort of soothing touch. How come my system doesn't go to sadness right away? So why? So it feels like in some ways an element of grief helps overcome anger. Is there sort of something we can learn from that?
Well, Mark, as I've told you, I hesitate to try to do psychotherapy online in a webinar. And so in a particular case, there's no telling why you go from anger to sadness, but it shows self-awareness that you even notice this. And I commend you for that. And that you have found a way to manage your anger, even if it takes you through some rough emotional passages. So I would say that actually you're on your way to a very positive self-management. You might want to deploy other methods. And you might want to explore where is the source of the hurt that you're soothing in your life. But that's not something we can do here online. It's something you might do with a counselor, actually.
Thank you. Very wise, Dan. Gary's asked, in these strange times with so much disruption in the world, how can we support and guide people who are less resilient to help them cope with the uncertainty around us?
Well, one of the first things you can do is manage your own emotions because emotions are contagious. It turns out that people who are very calm, who are very centered, can communicate that state to other people non-verbally. Through parts of the brain that connect invisibly brain to brain. They form a kind of emotional back channel to any interaction. So the first thing you can do is take care of yourself. Then the second thing you can do is listen, be present to the person. What is it that is actually going on with them? And having someone who is fully attentive, it creates a kind of healing presence. There are 3 kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy. You understand how the person thinks. You can be an effective communicator because you know the words they use to explain things. Then there's emotional empathy where you pick up what someone is feeling. And then the third kind of empathy is really important. It's called empathic concern. You care about the other person. It's in the brain, it's based on the mammalian caretaking circuits. It's a parent's love for a child. So if you can be there, if you can be present to the person with caring, it has a very healing and soothing effect on the person. They feel seen, heard, and cared about.
Thank you. Jason's asked a question about emotional intelligence in the workplace. How can we use emotional intelligence when we're facing sort of difficult situations? He's mentioned incivility from colleagues, so when people are treating us in a way that we feel upset about in the workplace.
Yeah, as I said, the first thing you can do is help yourself. Manage your reaction to the incivility rather than, for example, getting angry or being too passive and just taking it, but rather, being calm, being clear, and then maybe you can say something to the person if it's appropriate. If it's your boss, I'd recommend you don't say something. You might say something to the boss's peer, or you might send the boss's Vita out to an executive recruiter, and maybe they'll get a position somewhere else. It's a joke, but really some people have done it. But basically, I think the way to manage incivility is first to handle your own upset, and then, if appropriate, to say something to the other person.
That's very wise, and I can already feel that there were many times when I'm prone to react instantaneously rather than sort of calmly internalizing and dealing with it, and then choosing how to respond a bit more calmly and rationally. So thank you for that reminder.
Let
Ellie's
me,
asked a fascinating question. Oh, sorry, go on, Dan.
before we move on, there's a definition of maturity, which is widening the gap between your first impulse and how you actually react.
Mm,
In that gap, which you're talking about, Mark, you can decide, well, maybe there's a better way to respond,
mm.
and then respond that way. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a great reminder. Ellie's asked a fascinating question, which is it possible to have too high level of emotional intelligence that it might stop you getting things done or be able to focus on some more sort of achievement oriented aspects of life?
I think really you're talking about an imbalance in emotional intelligence. There's some people, for example, who have too much emotional empathy. There's research that shows that when people see someone in great pain or suffering, like a burn patient, they get flooded through that second kind of empathy, the emotional empathy. They get flooded themselves, and then they tune out, which is not helpful. So it really is important to manage your own reactions first, and then you can respond. And also, by the way, speaking about the workplace, the research really shows that the higher a person's emotional intelligence, the better their performance, the more loyal they are to their organization, the more likely they are to help out someone else, the better organizational citizen they become. So I don't think it's really possible to have too much emotional intelligence. You can have too little of this, though, and too much of that.
Thanks. And this has come from an anonymous attendee, but it's an interesting question, I think. But since you wrote your first book, and we're celebrating 25 years since the first book came out, what particularly have you learnt that sort of supplemented or changed your original thoughts about emotional intelligence? What's the sort of latest perspective that has changed
Sure.
along the way?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. For one, in the new introduction to the 25th edition, which is coming out now, I include an updated model of emotional intelligence. At first, I thought there were 5 parts to it. Now I see there are 4, the 4 I mentioned: self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and social skill. What I did was fold motivation, which I saw as something separate, into self-management, because keeping your eye on the goal despite setbacks, which is the drive to achieve. Some see it as motivation. I see it as something that's learned and learnable, and is a very effective way to help manage yourself. So that's one thing. And then within each of those 4 domains, there are about a dozen competencies that we see among outstanding people, leaders in the workplace, people who are high performers. And that model is in the new introduction to the 25th edition. And also, I've understood, as I said before, the importance of extending emotional intelligence and the awareness of it to the systems level, so that we can be more effective in acting for the common good.
We've got a question here from Heather, which I think may even be my own mum, who I know was planning to tune into this event. So hi, mum, if that is you. She said, please, could you comment on PTSD, which is, for those who aren't aware, post-traumatic stress disorder. Obviously, lots and lots of people dealing with severe trauma. And obviously, that can have a really long-lasting, lifelong impact on our kind of emotional regulation and responses to situations. What are your thoughts on how that links to EI, Dan?
Yes, it links very directly. In fact, the research shows that PTSD it means that you have an overly reactive amygdala. The amygdala is one of the key centers in the brain where the traumatic moment is stored. And when something comes along, which is reminiscent, might be a tone of voice, something subtle, it can trigger the whole reaction. And so I I think that there are kind of two ways to deal with PTSD. One is to know your triggers and what the emotional pattern is, how you automatically respond when you're triggered. And here I'd like to recommend my wife's book, Tara Bennett Goleman, Emotional Alchemy. She talks about the 10 most common kinds of trigger. And lots of us, everyone has something, as they say. So the book explains how to use mindfulness as a way to intervene in the reactivity. And then generally for trauma, it's important if you're working with trauma to know what your triggers are, why you're being triggered, and to try to widen that gap between your impulse and the reaction. But also it's very important to have an environment or a relationship with someone you trust, someone you feel safe with. Psychological safety is key to a remedy for a personal trauma. So I recommend all of those things. It's a tough one, and good luck.
Thanks, Dan. And I think that concept of psychological safety you just mentioned is fascinating. I'm not sure I fully understand it. Is there a way that we can help people feel more psychologically safe through our own actions?
Sure. Well, really, it comes from the work of John Bowlby, the British
Mm.
psychoanalyst, psychotherapist who studied children and realized that if a child was going to have a good emotional intelligence, emotional and psychological well-being over their life, it was important that a caretaker, a mom or a dad or someone tuned into them, empathized with them, understood them, and spoke to their needs and made them feel psychologically safe. And we can do that with people we love, people we care about, with anybody else, by being fully present and understand, really listening to what it is they are needing in the moment psychologically. And if we're able to provide that for them, or at least to give them a safe place, a safe relationship to be open and honest about what they're feeling.
Thanks. So I accidentally muted myself, the classic Zoom 2020 skill we've all developed. Lots of people have been asking about autism, Dan. Anya is just one I can see on screen right now. To what extent is it possible to help someone on the autistic spectrum to be able to develop or at least cultivate more emotional intelligence?
As far as we know, autism is brain-based, and it seems to be somewhat genetic in nature. I don't really buy theories that say it's learned. I think it's rather determined by birth. And one of the sad defects in people with autism or on the spectrum is a failure in the ability to empathize, to tune in, to be present to another person. And I think that the most immediate promising path to helping people with autism lead a more normal life, if they want to, is a workaround where people learn, for example, the norms of interaction, looking people in the eye, so on, shaking hands. And this is taught in some approaches to helping people with autism. And of course, we need to recognize there's a spectrum. And people with autism often have great gifts too. And you don't want to diminish the gifts at all. But if you want people to be able to handle, people on the spectrum to handle their own anxiety, and often great anxiety goes with this pattern, you can help them learn methods. And there are many, some of which you use, mindfulness being one. Deep relaxation or the breath practice I just shared might be another. And you need to do some experimentation to see what will help a given person.
Mm. Dan, a slight shift of topic. Here we are in hopefully the beginnings of a post-COVID world. Obviously, lots of promising news about vaccines coming out this week, but still really in the thick of a very difficult situation for our global family. One of the aspects of that, which I think does link to our emotional and social intelligence, is the extent to which our physical proximity to others has been sort of challenged. We've talked about social distancing. I've always felt that it's physical distancing that we need, not social distancing. We must stay socially connected. So Lundi's asked an interesting question. How do we create social connections or enhance our social connections in a digital and virtual world, whether that's post-COVID or anyway, where a lot of us are spending more time on screen? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, I think that it's important to recognize the need for, I like the term friendly distancing, because distancing is something you do because you care about yourself and the other person, and you want yourself and the other person to be safe and healthy. So it's a friendly thing to do. On the other hand, it's distancing. And it means that there's a whole category of interaction that we're missing now. and there are many people are feeling a great loneliness from the isolation. And how do we make up for it? I think we can partially remedy it. I don't think we can undo everything. I think we'll wait for a vaccination so that we can go back to life as normal. But while we're on Zoom with each other, while we're on webinar, it's important, I think, to reach out to another person you care about and do it separately from the meeting. Do it one-on-one, do it in a phone call. Phone carries a lot of emotional information. And a phone call to a friend or a colleague about the person, not about a job or about some project you're doing. Just how are you doing? How's life going? This is important. It's more important now than it has been in the past. I think it can't make up for everything, but at least it helps. And until we can go back to life as normal, doing that more and more to maintain connection and preserve the sense of relationship, I think is quite important.
And building on that, which I think is so wise, how do you see this balance around sharing our own emotional state and needs with others in certain different contexts? I mean, I'm, as with many others, very moved by Brené Brown and others' work about vulnerability and about when you can take off the mask and reveal your true self and what's really going on emotionally for you. That is, helping you process difficult emotions also brings the whole sort of spectrum of your authentic self more to the surface. But of course, there's certain times when that may be more appropriate than others with people you trust in certain situations. How can we judge when it's best to really reveal our emotional sort of inner state and when it might be wiser to sort of take a slightly different approach?
And I really applaud what you're talking about, Mark, because I think it creates huge closeness, even despite the, technology and the distancing. If you can be vulnerable with someone else, and that person vulnerable with you, open about their deepest feelings, that creates intense intimacy and rapport. And I think the question of with whom can you do that, you need to decide on the spot, who are you comfortable with? Who's comfortable with you? Are you pushing the other person more than they can handle by being open and vulnerable? So this, I think you need to use your empathy, your radar, emotional radar for the other person to sense in the moment.
So we've talked, Dan, about the importance of teaching emotional intelligence to children, the next generation, absolutely vital. Dr. Bravo Marcelo here has asked, how can we teach EQ to adults or even to seniors as opposed to teaching to kids? Perhaps where we haven't got the formal education system and maybe they're not involved in a mindfulness practice or something else. Are there any ways that we can help build that into later life as well?
Well, here's the challenge when you're working with older people, not with children. During childhood, we form anatomically our emotional and social circuitry of the brain. And maybe we've learned to manage our emotions well, or upsetting emotions. Maybe we've learned to empathize, or maybe not. And if you're dealing with someone who still, gets overly angry at the least trigger, and you want to help them, you have a double challenge because you have to overcome their deeply automatic habit and help them learn a new one. So you have a twofold task. I've worked with a lot of training and development officers and companies who are doing this with people who are adults, of course, at work. And the first question I urge them to ask the person is, do you care? Because if the person doesn't care, forget it. It takes effort and it's going to take time. And if the person cares, then can you give them some good feedback? There are instruments called 360-degree instruments, where people who you ask to evaluate you, these are people you know you well, whom you trust, and they evaluate you across, say, the spectrum of those competencies in my model. That one is the emotional and social competence inventory. It's a 360 for the workplace. But you want to be able to give the person or help them get honest feedback about where they could benefit from doing the most work, and it might be in their anger. Then you want to help them rehearse a different habit. What would you rather do? Rather than just, barking at the person you're angry at, would you like to count to 10 and then respond more evenly, more assertively, rather than aggressively? Well, let's practice it. And then you want to help that person practice at every naturally occurring opportunity in their lives. And Then, with luck, there will come a moment when they do the right thing, the new thing in the right way at the right time without even thinking about it, which means from a brain point of view, that habit is now based in the center for habits, the basal ganglia, and they'll have that habit, good habit for life. That's a successful habit change.
Dan, I know you've got lots of resources that we can potentially share with the community in our follow-up tomorrow. We'll send a link to the updated book. I believe you have a free resilience-based program. Is that correct?
Yes, and the URL I think you can give to people.
I can share with people, yes. Is there anything else you'd like to share in terms of resources that people could use to put some of this into practice as they leave this event?
And people who find this work interesting might want to know I'm starting a new podcast, and you can give the URL to help get that going, where I'll be interviewing people. I just did one with Laurie Santos, who taught this wonderful course on happiness at Yale.
Yes, Laurie's joined us for one of these webinars as well. She's fantastic.
Exactly, yeah. So people who interest me will be on the podcast, and I think you'll be able to mention other resources. But yes, the resilience program for people who really want to work on, and with lockdown and COVID, we're all being challenged. This is a free program that's being offered. And Mark, it's kind of you to put that and other resources people may want to follow up on your website.
Kind of you to share so much of this stuff, for free with the world, Dan. We're rapidly running out of time. A couple of questions here. Judy has said, are there any other exercises that Dan could briefly share with us to help us relax? And related to that, Chantal said, could we do that deep breathing again at the end, please? It was so special. Thank you, Dan. So Dan, would you like to share one other idea, or perhaps just another mindful breath or two with us?
Well, let's do the deep breathing, just to be sure, because if you want to master it, it's good to practice it. So here we go. Breathe in deeply. You can close your eyes if you want. So your belly expands. Hold that breath as long as is comfortable for you. Then exhale slowly. And again, breathe in deeply, expand your belly. Hold it. And when you need to, just exhale slowly. And again, deep inhalation, belly expand. Hold it. Exhale slowly. And there you go. And on your own, you can do this 6 to 9 times when you feel you really need it. Thank you, Mark.
Dan, thank you. I'm seeing so much gratitude and lovely comments on the chat. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for all the great contributions. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to answer more of the questions, but thank you for all the great questions that came in. Dan, just as we leave with a minute to spare, I wondered if you had any final thoughts to sort of summarize this idea of emotional intelligence and particularly how we can put it into practice in the situation we find ourselves in the world right now. What would you like to leave us with?
Sure, just a few words. First, help yourself. Then second, tune in, be present for other people. And third, show them that you care. That's emotional intelligence.
That's very wise, very moving, and very much appreciated. Dan, thank you so much for making time for this and for being here. And thank you all for joining us on this event. And we will be sharing the follow-up resources and video with you soon. Dan, it's a pleasure to see you again. Best of luck and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure.